The Indonesian government steps in to halt speculators' attacks on the national currency. Eurotunnel faces legal moves to block an agreement reached with its creditor banks. And Kenya's government passes an economic reform package, but the IMF still withholds an aid package. The Indonesian government has taken steps to prevent further assaults on its currency, the rupiah. It's limiting forward foreign exchange selling against the currency in order to clamp down on speculative buying of the US dollar. This latest move follows a sharp slump in the rupiah and equity markets of Southeast Asia at the end of last week. The region's currencies have come under sustained attack by speculators, which have knocked them down to record lows. This action by the Indonesian government follows similar moves by Malaysia, Thailand and Singapore. Over the last month, the rupiah has fallen by 11%, suffering particularly after it was allowed to float freely from the 19th of August. Well, to find out more about why the currencies of Southeast Asia have been under such sustained pressure, I'm now joined by Derek Ross, a Treasury partner at Deloitte & Touche. Derek, other countries in the region have put into effect similar steps as Indonesia. What makes Indonesia think that these are going to work better for it?
There's no particular reason why it should necessarily work better. Interestingly, Indonesia was one of the countries in the area which began to defend its currency with an enormous increase in interest rates only some time back. And it's particularly interesting that they are banning the forward selling of their currency because, in fact, Malaysia, only a week or two, indicated it was actually supporting its own currency by massive intervention in the forward market, by forward buying its own currency to the extent, in fact, of over $24 billion.
So what do you think the effect will actually be?
Well, the effect on both currency market participants and, of course, equity market participants, because we've seen, as you know, huge drops in the equity markets in these countries, is very much dependent upon confidence. And the markets generally don't like government intervention, they don't like government controls. And the problems in the area, some people are suggesting, was catalysed last week by the statement in Malaysia that there were going to be new controls imposed on the securities markets to ban short selling. So generally the mood of market participants is adverse towards government regulation.
So what can they do about it, though? Surely governments want to be able to have some control and take the situation in hand. What can they do?
Well, we saw exactly the same problems with sterling when it was ejected from the exchange rate mechanism. You remember, one morning interest rates went up to 15% and then were hauled right back again, and there was absolutely no effect at all. One of the problems that we have in respect of these currencies is that although it seems like a really major problem for the world economy, these economies actually in total, excluding Japan, are relatively small. They account for less than 5% of world GNP, and therefore compared with the amount of liquidity and investment around the world's financial markets, relatively small movements in portfolio investment can have big effects on both currency and stock markets.
So what's your outlook for the week ahead? We've seen sharp falls on even the Hang Seng in Hong Kong on Friday. Are those falls going to continue as the week goes on?
Well, who's to know? I mean, markets can easily rebound. The effect in Hong Kong is particularly interesting because, of course, the Hong Kong economy generally is regarded as extremely strong. But, of course, particularly when investors begin to pull their money out, and, of course, America's on holiday on Monday for Labor Day, when the fund managers, particularly in New York, come back to work on Tuesday, who's to know? If there's forced redemptions, if there are sales which will force redemptions of mutual funds, unit trusts as we call them in the UK, the fund managers have to look for the most liquid market, and the one they can actually take profits in is Hong Kong. So maybe Hong Kong may suffer as a result of a knock-on effect from the rest of the region.
Derek Ross, thanks very much indeed.
You're welcome.
A French court will be asked on Monday to block the agreement reached by Eurotunnel and its creditor banks in July. Under the deal, the banks will take a 45% stake in the tunnel in return for rescheduling billions of dollars of debt from Paris.
It's 7 weeks since a yes vote by shareholders seemed to have ended the long-running wrangle over the financing of the company's debt. By a huge majority, shareholders backed a plan to give the 170 creditor banks just over 45% of the shares in the company. In return, the banks would reschedule some £7 billion of debt. For the shareholders, many of whom have seen their savings vanish down the black hole of Eurotunnel's debt, it was a bitter decision to take. They were persuaded, though, there was no alternative. But the representative of one shareholders group refuses to agree, and he's asking a French court to declare the July deal void. He claims that the banks had acted illegally in concert in making their offer and should have been forced to bid for the shares. He also claims the deal is based on too high a valuation of Eurotunnel's debt. Eurotunnel says a ruling by the court could affect the debt restructuring arrangements, but would not unpick the deal reached with the banks. A spokesman said that if the court found for the rebel shareholders, the deal would not collapse the next day. Some shareholders would not necessarily mind if it did. They think they stand a better chance of recovering part of their money in the French bankruptcy courts.
The International Monetary Fund has not released much-needed financial aid to Kenya, despite the passing of a reform package by the government in Nairobi. The IMF suspended a $220 million loan in July, claiming that the government had failed to combat corruption and improve the management of the energy sector. Vivian Morgan reports from Kenya on the problems that have undermined economic progress.
Inside the Nairobi Stock Exchange, where the market has been hit by a sequence of bad news events. First, there was news of the IMF cancelling its loan to Kenya because of corruption levels. As a result, many foreign investors, who make up some 35% of the market, sold off treasury bonds, so the Kenyan shilling took a dive. Next came the street demonstrations, strikes and riots, protesting at wage levels and the lack of electoral reforms before the October elections. The central bank has been forced to intervene and the markets remain nervous.
We are definitely going to suffer a drop in terms of our turnovers, our performance in the market. For how long this continues depends on how soon we get down to address the issues at hand.
As people protested in the streets, businessmen realized that the violence both in the capital Nairobi and on the coast will affect investments especially.
Certain categories will get hit, but if you're into basic commodities, the man in the village has to eat, the man in the village has to transport goods, etc., etc. So I think at the moment that the overall situation is one that is inflamed, yes, it goes up and down, but I think it's over-exaggerated.
For the country's 80,000 Asians, like Jula Alvin Andrus, who have been attacked before in times of political upheaval, notably in 1992 at the last elections, they fear the worst for their businesses.
You can't tell what's going to happen. A riot can start any time, yeah? And we have to close down the shop, and like I said, we survive on tourism, and if there are no tourists coming to the town, then we've got no business.
The Kenyan economy has been in the doldrums, and as Manu Chandaria, the head of the Association of Manufacturers, explains, they just felt that some progress was being made when the latest political unrest erupted.
It took us 3 years to really bring the interest rate down to 18% of the treasury bills, and inflation within 10%, on single digit. Now, if we are not very careful, we'll again move into a direction which will be very difficult to again stop.
The country's lack of infrastructure, poor roads, bad telephone connections and power cuts, in the capital Nairobi especially, have frustrated the business community. But the worst culprit for slowing the economy has been the corruption. Kenya, along with Nigeria and Pakistan, are the 3 worst countries in the world, according to the Berlin research company Transparency International. The Attorney General, Amos Waku, has produced a tough anti-corruption bill for Parliament to debate, but is this too little, too late?
I think that the corruption is something which has become a part, and in most of the countries there is corruption, but it depends upon the degree of corruption. And in this country, the corruption has set in such high places and with such large amounts that it's sometimes very difficult to pinpoint.
The tourism industry is Kenya's second largest after tea and brings in more than $450 million annually. It's now being hit by cancellations. Top-class hotels like the Norfolk, where foreign tourists stay, will suffer, as well as the smaller ones, where one German hotel manager says they've been hit by cancellations already. President Daniel Arap Moi celebrates his 19th year in office, but it's not a happy year either for him or for his country. As Nairobi tries to go about its business, it does seem that the postponement of change in both the constitutional and economic arena is bringing this once prosperous country to its knees.
Well, I'm joined now by Christopher Hartland-Peel from Standard Bank London, who also used to live in Kenya himself. Now, what steps does the IMF want to see in place before it's prepared to resume this loan package?
There are 4 key issues which the IMF is looking at. Anti-corruption, it's looking at the Kenya Revenue Authority, the public agencies, that they function autonomously, and the recent power sector contracts which they allege were tainted with corruption.
And how much action do you think the IMF actually wants to see? Do you think it wants to see these actions in place before it resumes the aid? Or just is the commitment enough?
First of all, they want to see the commitment, but they would like to see solid progress going towards solving these issues, resolving them, because they've gone on for many, many years, as the commentators have said before.
Well, let's get this into context. How important is that aid money to Kenya?
It is important, but it's not vitally important. Zimbabwe has only recently signed up with the IMF again after a lapse of 18 months. Life goes on.
But we have seen foreign investors pulling out in droves, as we heard in that report. Surely, if the IMF has its faith in Kenya, then foreign investors will return.
Droves is the wrong word. Yes, they've been hesitant, but there's been very little foreign volume on selling. We see that from our office and the transactions which go through. There have been purchases.
Now, corruption has been one of the headline items, if you like, of these problems. How easy, though, is it to tackle something like corruption in a country as big as Kenya?
As the IMF has said, it's high-level corruption, therefore it's to resolve it at the higher levels, at the highest levels. Therefore, it's for, I would say, permanent secretary level and above to resolve these issues. It's not the man in the street, it's not the junior civil servant, it's the high-level one. Therefore, people know the government. Therefore, I would say is what you're looking at is accountability, disclosure, and perhaps external audit may be very useful, and publishing the results. Bring it out into the public domain.
Christopher Hartland-Peel, thanks very much indeed. And finally, if you have any questions or comments, you can, of course, email us at biznews@bbc.co.uk. But for now, that's it from the BBC's World Business Report. From us all, goodbye.